The arena is dark and full of theories.
Before there was an arrow, there was a vote, and any honest accounting of what happened in the city circle that winter has to begin in the windowless room where the vote was taken, because nothing that followed makes sense without it. 7 people sat around a table built for committee work, not history. Haymitch Abernathy slouched at one end, working through whatever he'd managed to scavenge from a half-looted Capitol cellar, his eyes more alert than his posture suggested. Johanna Mason sat with her arms crossed and her chair pushed back from the table, the posture of someone who had decided, long before the meeting started, that she would not be made comfortable in this room, no matter how the conversation went. Annie Cresta sat very still, her hands folded in her lap so tightly the knuckles had gone pale, newly widowed and visibly working to keep her composure in a room full of people who had learned, the hard way, not to expect composure from her. B.T. Laddier kept shifting his weight off his bad leg, his expression the careful blank of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Enobaria said nothing for most of the meeting, her dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker with the patient attention of someone who had survived the Capitol's arenas by never looking surprised. Peeta Mellark sat closest to the door, not from rudeness but from habit. A year of captivity had taught his body to always know where the exits were, even in rooms that posed no danger. And Katniss Everdeen sat across from President Coin, having not slept in 4 days, the inside of her skull still ringing faintly with the noise of the Capitol's last battle. Coin did not raise her voice. She rarely did. It was, in its way, the most unsettling thing about her, the sense that whatever she said next would be delivered with exactly the same calm, regardless of its content. She explained, in the unhurried tone of a woman reading a supply manifest, that there would be one final Hunger Games, a symbolic games, she called it, the word doing the work of laundering what was, underneath, an act of pure retribution dressed up in the language of closure. The tributes, she said, would be drawn from Capitol families. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that President Snow's own granddaughter would be eligible. This is the detail later historians of the Second Rebellion would keep returning to, not that Coin proposed the idea, but that she insisted on a vote, as though a show of democratic process could launder what was, underneath, simple vengeance wearing the old regime's clothes. She wanted their names on it. She wanted, specifically, Katniss's name on it. Peeta spoke first against it, and spoke carefully, the way he always did when he was trying to keep his voice from shaking with how much he meant something. This is exactly what we fought to end, he said. If we do this, we don't win the war. We just become the ones who get to run it next. Annie nodded beside him, too raw still to add much, though she managed, quietly, that she had buried one war already and didn't want to spend whatever was left of her sanity helping start another. BT voted no on practical grounds dressed as principle. That a nation trying to rebuild trust in its institutions could not simultaneously be staging children's deaths for catharsis. Though everyone in the room understood that underneath the practicality was the same revulsion the other two had stated plainly. Johanna and Enobaria voted yes, and neither felt any particular need to justify it to a room full of people who had not personally watched the Capitol disassemble them, piece by piece, for entertainment. Johanna, in particular, said only that she had spent a year listening to Capitol-accented voices laugh while she screamed, and did not feel any obligation to spare the children of people who had laughed. No one in the room argued the point with her, though more than one of them privately doubted whether the children in question bore any responsibility for what their parents had found entertaining. Haymitch voted yes as well, quietly, his eyes on Katniss the entire time rather than on Coin, the way a man watches someone walk toward a cliff edge he can't reach in time to stop them. Katniss voted yes. She did not explain, in that room, the calculation underneath it, that she had already decided, privately, that she would be the one to put the killing arrow into Snow with her own hands at the execution everyone expected to follow. And a yes vote here was simply the currency required to remain trusted enough, useful enough, to be the one handed the bow. Coin, for her part, agreed to the bargain without seeming to notice she'd made one. The games, she said, would be announced once Snow's account had been formally closed. First, the old debt settled. Then, the new one opened. The vote passed, 4-3. The room emptied without anyone saying much else. Days later, in the city circle, the same plaza where, for 3/4 of a century, victors had stepped off gilded chariots into a roar of manufactured adoration, a very different crowd had gathered to watch President Snow die. Katniss stood at the mark she'd been given, a bow in her hands that she had not asked for, and an arrow she had no intention of using the way she'd been instructed. The cold came up through her boots from packed snow that had been trampled gray-brown by the crowd's restless shifting. Around her, close enough that she could feel the wool of their coats brush her sleeve, stood a security detail she did not recognize. Young, hard-eyed, recently elevated into Coin's personal guard from outside the old Star Squad, Squad 451, that had bled with her through the capital's ruined avenues. They had no history with her, no debt of shared survival to slow their hands if it came to it. That had been, she would understand only later, exactly the point. Coin had spent the week since the surrender quietly redrawing the map of who stood close enough to her to matter, and these were the ones who owed everything to the new president and nothing at all to the Mockingjay. Gale stood 20 feet off, near enough that she could see the specific way his jaw worked when he was holding something back, far enough that nearness wouldn't have mattered anyway. Since Prim's death there had been a wall between them neither of them had built on purpose, and neither knew how to take apart, made of a single unanswered question, whose bomb design, exactly, had it been? She felt him watching her raise the bow. She felt him notice, because no one else who had hunted at her side for years would have caught it. The small, deliberate shift in her wrist that meant the arrow's true destination was not the kneeling man in chains in front of her. He hesitated. It was not cowardice, not exactly. And it was not betrayal either. It was the particular paralysis of a man who had spent a year learning to doubt his own instincts about what was right, watching the one decision he might have made instinctively arrive a half-second too late to matter. By the time his hand began to move toward the nearest guard, the guard had already moved on his own. A grip closed over Katniss's forearm before the draw finished. The string slipped wrong, the arrow loosing sideways with no force behind it, arcing low and falling, spent and useless, into the trampled snow at Coriolanus Snow's feet. Snow watched it happen with an expression that might, on another man's face, have passed for mild interest in a slightly disappointing weather report. He had spent a long life studying the precise moment a person's professed idealism curdled into the very thing it claimed to stand against. And something in him, old, tired, almost satisfied, recognized that he was watching it happen now, not as a twist he hadn't foreseen, but as the oldest story there was, finding a new cast to wear its costume. You and I, he said, to no one in particular, to the cold air, to whatever version of history might still be listening, were never as different as you needed to believe, in what we'd both prove willing to become. When the soldier assigned to finish the sentence the arrow hadn't stepped forward to do it properly, Snow laughed, a real laugh, wet and rattling, blood already pooling thin at the corner of his mouth, from decades of self-administered poison meant to build an immunity nobody else's body could match, and he was still laughing, faintly, when it was over. Katniss was pulled back through the crowd while Coin's voice, calm and almost gentle, explained to the cameras that the Mockingjay was being escorted to safety, that the trauma of the moment had clearly overwhelmed her, that this was protection, not restraint. The framing took root within the hour. By evening, half of Panem believed exactly what they'd been told to believe. The spent arrow lay where it had fallen for most of the day, no one quite willing to be the one who picked it up. It stayed there at the edge of the dispersing crowd, marking the precise spot where the future had almost bent a different direction and, in the end, had not. By nightfall, the official account of the afternoon had already hardened into something close to legend, helped along by a propaganda office that had spent 2 years learning, under Plutarch Heavensby's careful direction, exactly how fast a story could outrun the truth if it left early enough. The footage that aired across Panem that evening had been trimmed with surgical precision. The half-second of Gale's hesitation excised entirely, the new guard's intervention reframed as a swift, almost tender rescue of a grieving war hero from her own understandable instability. Coin's calm voice laid over the top of it like a lullaby. "She has given this country everything," the broadcast said, in Coin's own measured cadence. "Now it is our turn to protect her from herself." Haymitch watched the broadcast from a borrowed room 3 floors below the one where Katniss was being held for observation, a glass of something he hadn't bothered to identify going warm in his hand. He had spent more of his life than he cared to count learning to read the particular shape of a story being built around someone. And he recognized this one instantly, because he'd watched the Capitol build an almost identical one around Katniss after the 74th Games, the same flattering, infantilizing narrative, wrapped around an inconvenient act of defiance, until the defiance itself disappeared from the official record entirely. He did not say any of this out loud to the 2 guards posted outside his door. He simply finished what was in the glass and went looking for Plutarch, on the theory that a man clever enough to have spent years running a secret rebellion from inside the game maker's office might still, with the right incentive, be talked into running one more operation from somewhere a little closer to the new president's blind spot. Plutarch, when Haymitch found him, was watching the same footage with an expression that gave away nothing useful, which was, in its own way, an answer. "She voted yes," Plutarch said quietly, not quite meeting Haymitch's eyes. "I keep coming back to that. She voted yes, and now she's the one being punished for what the vote produced." It was the closest either of them came, that night, to admitting how thoroughly the new government had already learned the old one's habit of making its victims complicit in their own suffering, one reasonable-sounding compromise at a time. 3 days after Snow's body was disposed of, with no public funeral and no grave anyone could gather around, President Coin returned to the city circle to address a nation she now governed without the inconvenience of an opposing executive. Her speech, whether by calculation or simple habit absorbed from 75 years of the system she claimed to be replacing, borrowed the exact cadence of old Capitol broadcasts. Talk of sacrifice, of renewal, of a balance the districts deserve to see restored. The same vocabulary Caesar Flickerman had once used to dress children's deaths up as celebration, now repurposed without apparent irony to dress vengeance up as justice. She reminded the nation that this had already been approved. "By your own war heroes," she said, never once mentioning the closed door, the 4-3 margin, the 3 dissenting voices that had called it exactly what it was. The 76th Hunger Games, she announced, would proceed. Its tributes would be drawn exclusively from Capitol households. It was, more than anything Coin had done before or would do after, the clearest evidence for the argument that would come to define how historians eventually read those final weeks of the war, that a revolution which keeps its oppressors instruments, even while insisting its intentions are different, ends up reproducing exactly what it overthrew, instrument by instrument, until the only thing that's actually changed is who's holding the controls. She closed her address with a line that propaganda analysts would dissect for years afterward. Precisely because of how unoriginal it was, Panem has bled enough on the district's side of the ledger. It is time the balance was felt by everyone. It was, almost word for word, the same justification President Snow had once used to explain why the Hunger Games existed at all. A punishment owed, a debt finally collected, and the fact that no one in Coin's speechwriting office seemed to notice the echo said more about the new government's self-awareness than any leaked memo could have. The broadcast that carried her speech across Panem was produced, edited, and scored with the same technical polish the old Capitol propaganda machine had always used, simply because the people running the cameras and the music cues were, in most cases, the very same people, conscripted rather than replaced. A junior composer who had once scored victory tour footage for President Snow found himself, weeks later, scoring Coin's announcement with an almost identical swell of strings at almost identical moments, and would say afterward, when finally asked, that he hadn't noticed the resemblance until it was already airing, because he had simply done the job the way the job had always been done. The reaping itself bore no resemblance to the ritualized stoicism that 3 generations of district families had built, slowly and at terrible cost, into something they could survive. District reapings, by the time of the rebellion, had calcified into custom the long, deliberately unhurried walk to the square, the murmured warnings passed mother to child about not volunteering, not drawing attention, not standing out, the practiced numbness on every face that had become, itself, a kind of armor against an old familiar horror. 74 years had given the districts time to grow antibodies. The capital had none. It had never needed any. So the capital's first reaping was not somber. It was chaos. A woman near the fountain went down in a dead faint the moment the first name was called, and had to be dragged clear by strangers. A man tried, openly and without apparent shame, to press a fistful of jewelry torn straight from his wife's throat into the gloved hand of the escort, as though the capital's own rules might still be negotiable the way capital rules always had been for people who could afford to negotiate them. Another man, a former mid-level ministry official, who had spent the old regime's final years quietly currying favor with anyone who might survive its fall, pushed forward waving a folded document he insisted proved his family's exemption under some clause of the surrender terms no one else in the crowd had ever heard of, and was removed by 2 guards with a briskness that suggested his paperwork, real or invented, had never had any chance of mattering. A mother near the back of the crowd, recognizable from old victory tour footage as a minor capital socialite, screamed her son's name so many times that her voice gave out entirely before the second name was even drawn, and stood afterward with her mouth still moving, no sound left in it. Children were pried, 1 finger at a time, from parents who would not let go, by a guard whose gray uniforms bore an uncomfortable resemblance, in cut, if not quite in color, to the capital's old peacekeeper gray. Whether that resemblance was an accident of available fabric stock or a deliberate signal from someone in Coin's office was a question more than one historian would later spend a career arguing over without resolution. What no one disputed was the effect on anyone who had lived through a district reaping and now watched a capital one, the same rifles, the same crowd control formations, the same clinical procedure for prying a population apart from its children, simply turned to point in the opposite direction. A handful of the younger guards, old enough to have grown up hearing about the games rather than enforcing them, too young to have built up any professional indifference, visibly flinched at their own orders. One girl, barely out of training herself, lowered her weapon for 3 full seconds before a superior's glance brought it back up. She would not be the last to hesitate that year, and some of those hesitations, in time, would matter. Among the names drawn that day was a girl of 12 named Iris Snow. She had been, by every surviving account, an unremarkable child, in the precise way that made her unremarkableness so unbearable afterward. Months earlier, before any of this, on an evening she would later be unable to stop replaying, she had sat curled against her grandfather's side in the mansion's private viewing room, while the broadcast played footage of Katniss weeping over Peeta after his rescue from the arena, and she had asked, in the unguarded way only a child that age could manage, whether anyone would ever love her that much. Snow had looked down at her for a long moment, his expression softening into something almost no one else in Panem had ever been permitted to see, and said only, "And so you shall, my darling. So you shall." It was the kind of memory that did not survive contact with what came after. She would spend the arena trying, without success, to square the man who had said that to her with the things she later learned he had ordered done to other people's grandchildren. She had worn her hair pulled back in Katniss Everdeen's signature braid, simply because, for one strange season, it had become fashionable among capital schoolgirls to do so. A small irony nobody in the mansion seemed to notice at the time, least of all Snow, who found the trend mildly distasteful but not yet worth correcting. He had noticed eventually. When he declared the Mockingjay symbol an act of treason punishable by death, broadcast live to the entire nation in the clipped, certain tone he used for announcements he considered settled, she had, quietly, without being told to, undone the braid that same week and never worn it again, understanding, in the wordless way children sometimes understand things before they can explain them, exactly what it had come to represent. She had not understood, walking to the reaping stage with her chin up the way she'd been taught a Snow should always hold it, that she had already been discussed once before, in a closed room she'd never entered, by people whose faces she would not have recognized if they'd passed her on the street. The crowd's silence by the time the names had all been drawn was not chosen. It was enforced at rifle point, by soldiers in gray, a tableau that, had anyone still been filming propos for the historical record, would have rhymed precisely, shot for shot. With 74 years of district reapings broadcast in the opposite direction. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, unnoticed by the cameras and unremarked upon in any official account, an elderly woman who had once sold flowers in the city circle market for 40 years, without missing a single reaping broadcast, found herself, for the first time in her life, unable to watch the screen mounted above the square, and turned away entirely, toward the fountain, until it was over. They handed Katniss a title before they handed her an assignment, Mentor. The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well, the echo taking a very long time to finish. The capital's old training center had survived the fighting more or less intact, and rather than build something new, a project that would have cost coin months she had no intention of spending, her administration simply repurposed it within the week, conscripting its surviving staff under threat of trial for collaboration, and putting the building's elevators, simulation rooms, and observation decks back into use for a new and inverted purpose. The same glass-walled gymnasium where capital game makers had once scored frightened district children now hosted frightened Capital Ones, watched over by district-born mentors assigned, with what felt like deliberate cruelty, to keep their charges alive just long enough to die on schedule, on camera, for an audience that had finally been handed the other side of the screen. Katniss met Iris Snow on the second day, in a hallway that smelled absurdly of the exact antiseptic and hairspray combination she remembered from her own reaping 8 years and 2 games earlier. The girl looked up at her with an expression Katniss recognized instantly and despised herself for recognizing. Hope, the particular, fragile, irrational hope of someone who has decided, against all the available evidence, that you might be the one adult in the building who actually intends to help. "You're supposed to keep me alive," Iris said. "It wasn't a question. I'm supposed to try," Katniss said, and worked to keep her voice as flat and procedural as she could manage. Mentor mode, Haymitch used to call it, back when she had been terrible at performing it for her own District 12 tributes, too raw and too young to fake the necessary distance. She was better at the performance now. That, on its own, felt like its own kind of horror, proof of exactly how much practice the intervening years had given her. She ran the girl through the same machinery she remembered from the other side of it, the elevator with its district-numbered, now household-numbered, lighting, the stylists fitting costumes onto children who would be ash within the week regardless of how they looked doing it, the training scores handed down by men who had, in more than one case, handed down hers as well. She kept her dialogue clipped, professional, careful never to ask about Iris's family, never to mention the braid she'd noticed in old footage, never to let herself wonder out loud what this girl had actually been taught to believe about the woman now walking her through the same machinery that had once tried to kill that same woman twice. She was assigned a second charge as well, a quiet, watchful boy named Felix, who said almost nothing during the first 3 days, and spent his training sessions mostly watching Iris rather than practicing anything himself, as though he had already privately decided that his own survival mattered less than making sure someone he'd grown up 2 streets from did not die alone. Katniss recognized the particular shape of that loyalty. She had built her own life around an identical instinct once, and she found she could not bring herself to discourage it in him, even knowing exactly how it was likely to end. Not every mentor managed the performance as well as she did. Enobaria, assigned 2 tributes of her own down the hall, made no attempt at all to soften the experience for the children in her charge, training them with the same brutal efficiency she'd once been trained with herself, on the theory never stated outright, but obvious to anyone who watched her work, that false comfort was its own kind of cruelty, and that the only honest gift left to give was a slightly better chance. Katniss disagreed with the approach without ever saying so aloud, partly because she suspected in her worst moments that Enobaria might simply be the more clear-eyed of the 2 of them about what kindness could and couldn't actually accomplish here. It was only alone, in the narrow service stairwell between the simulation floor and the dormitories. The one stretch of the building where no camera had yet been installed, an oversight Katniss had quietly confirmed, and then said nothing about, that the performance cracked, briefly, into something closer to grief, before she smoothed her face back into the right shape and returned to the hallway. The training sessions themselves followed a script she could have recited in her sleep, because she had, in fact, lived it. She walked Iris through edible plant identification using the same illustrated cards she remembered from her own week in this building, watched the girl's hands shake too badly to tie a snare knot correctly on the first 12 attempts, corrected her grip on a kitchen knife repurposed as the closest thing to a weapon the new game makers had been willing to issue for demonstration. She did not coach her toward camouflage or combat the way the old career district mentors had once coached their tributes, because there was no version of competence that would matter here, not really, and they both seemed to understand that without either of them saying so. What she taught instead, in the end, were the things that had kept her own sister briefly safer in a world that did not care whether she lived. How to go still and quiet when something dangerous passed nearby. How to ration a single canteen of water across a day. How to recognize, in another person's face, the specific signs that meant they had stopped being able to think clearly and had become dangerous precisely because of it. A letter from Haymitch reached her on the 5th day, smuggled in folded inside a ration crate with a casualness that suggested either remarkable carelessness or remarkable confidence on the part of whoever was running the smuggling, and she suspected, reading it, that it was the latter. It was short and unsigned, in case it was intercepted, but she knew the handwriting the way she knew her own. Keep them alive as long as you can stand to. Don't let them see you care until it's already too late for anyone to stop you. That's the only trick I ever had, and it worked exactly once. She read it twice and burned it in the stairwell where no camera could see her do that either. That same evening, alone in her assigned quarters, she allowed herself, for the first time since the execution, to take stock of exactly how much weight she was now carrying without anyone's permission to set any of it down. She thought of the version of herself who had once needed Haymitch to remind her that mentoring was a performance, and the version of herself now teaching that same performance to someone else, and could not decide whether the distance between those 2 selves represented growth or simply a deeper kind of damage wearing growth's clothing. She did not resolve the question. She rarely did, with questions like that one. She had learned instead simply to keep functioning around them. The way a person learns to walk around a piece of furniture too heavy to move. She caught herself, once, humming the 4-note tune her father had taught her years before Rue had ever heard it, and stopped abruptly. unsettled by how naturally it had risen up in a building full of capital children who had never once been taught to fear the things it had always meant in the districts. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that an entire generation of capital citizens was about to learn, the hard way and far too late, every lesson the districts had spent 75 years being forced to learn first. She thought of Peeta exactly twice that day, both times by accident, both times like brushing a finger against something still burned. Coins restrictions kept the two of them on opposite ends of the building, ostensibly for security reasons that no one bothered explaining in detail. Katniss understood, without being told, that the real reason was simpler than security. A mockingjay and a man the capital had spent a year trying to weaponize against her were together. A variable coin preferred to keep separated rather than manage. Peeta Mellark had never been a soldier. Not really. Not even during the months the rebellion had tried hardest to make him into one. He had been, his whole life, the boy who noticed when someone else was starving and gave them bread anyway, even when it cost him a beating from his own mother for the waste of it. That instinct had not died in the hijacking, however close the capital's engineered nightmares had come to burning it out of him, along with everything else they'd tried to take. If anything, the war had sharpened that same instinct into something closer to a doctrine, one he now found himself, almost without choosing to, organizing other people around. He still had bad days. The flashbacks came less often than they had during the worst months of his deprogramming, the screaming nights when his own hands had felt, to him, like someone else's weapon, but they had not stopped entirely, and the people around him, Annie especially, with her own hard-earned fluency in the grammar of trauma, had learned to watch for the warning signs, the stillness just before the flinch, the half-second when his hands seemed to forget, briefly, whose hands they actually were. What he assembled, in the weeks following the vote, was not a battle plan. It was a conscience with a recruitment problem, and it solved that problem one conversation at a time. Annie came first, drawn less by ideology than by a clarity that was almost unbearable in its precision. She had spent her own games learning to read fear in real time, in bodies too far gone to voice it, and she recognized, in footage of the Capitol reaping smuggled out by a sympathetic editor in the propaganda office against Coin's explicit instructions, the exact physiology of children about to be slaughtered for an audience that had not yet decided how to feel about it. She and Johanna had never been close. In the years since their own games ended, Johanna's armor was sarcasm and contempt worn loud enough to keep most people at arm's length, while Annie's was a kind of careful, deliberate stillness that made her easy to underestimate and easier still to overlook. It was Peeta, in the end, who put them in a room together and left, on the theory that two women who had each survived the Capitol in completely different ways might recognize something useful in each other if given no audience to perform for. He was right. Johanna, alone with Annie for the first time without anyone watching, dropped the performance almost immediately and admitted, in a voice gone suddenly young, that she'd spent every night since the war ended dreaming about water rising in a chamber she could not unsee, and Annie, who understood exactly what it cost to say that out loud, simply said that she dreamed about the ocean too. Except hers no longer pulled her under, and offered, without being asked, to teach her the breathing exercises that had eventually let her sleep again. It became, over the following weeks, the closest thing either of them had to a friendship, built less on shared cause than on a shared fluency in surviving the unsurvivable. Johanna came next, and brought with her the thing Peeta's conscience alone could never have supplied, the willingness to plan a breach the way you'd plan a kill, methodically, without flinching from the math. She had survived a year of capital custody by memorizing every weakness in a system that had been designed, on paper, to have none. And she turned that same unsentimental attention now on District 13's own architecture, bunker schematics smuggled from a sympathetic clerk, guard rotation logs copied late at night, the specific gaps in a surveillance network that 13 had originally built to watch its own citizens, never imagining it might one day need watching from the inside. The clerk who provided the schematics was a thin, anxious man named Castor Ware, a records officer who had spent the war keeping inventory of bunker supplies, and had spent the years before that, quietly and at some personal risk, married to a man from District 8 whom the old capital regime would have executed for the relationship alone, had it ever come to light. He did not consider himself a revolutionary. He considered himself, he told Johanna in the one conversation they ever had about it, someone who had watched enough governments decide which categories of person were disposable to recognize the patterns starting again, regardless of which flag happened to be flying over it. He asked for nothing in return except that no one ever say his name in connection with what came next, a request Johanna kept, mostly except in the private notes she made for herself, on the theory that someone should remember. Trust between the four of them, Peeta, Annie, Johanna, and a man none of them had expected to need, built slowly and unevenly, the way trust always did among people whose previous experience of institutions had taught them, almost universally, that institutions eventually betrayed you. It was Peeta who finally cracked the last of Castor's reserve, not through any grand gesture but by remembering, weeks into their arrangement, the name of Castor's husband and asking, without an agenda attached to the question, how he was holding up. Castor had not expected to be asked that by anyone connected to this particular plan, and something in him relaxed, visibly, for the first time since he'd handed over the schematics. Peeta's worst moment came on a night none of the others were meant to witness, 3 days before the breach was finally ready. He had been reviewing the schematics with Johanna when a junction box overhead sparked and failed with a sharp, bright crack, and for nearly a full minute afterward he was not in the room at all. He was back in the white-tiled cell, where the capital's doctors had spent months teaching his own mind to turn against the person he loved most, his hands curling into the shape they had been trained to make, his breath gone short and animal. Johanna did not touch him. She had learned, secondhand from Annie, that touching him in that state could make it worse, could read, to whatever part of him the hijacking had rewired, as an attack. She simply talked, low and steady and almost bored-sounding, the way you'd talk to a spooked animal, reciting the inventory numbers off the schematics in front of them until his breathing slowed and his eyes came back into focus and found hers. Neither of them mentioned it again. It went into none of the plans, and it changed nothing about whether he would be there for what came next, because by morning he had already decided, the way he decided most things, that the alternative was unthinkable. BT, contacted last and most carefully, agreed to help from a remote terminal he could plausibly claim was being used for unrelated engineering work, on the condition that no one ask him afterward to explain, under oath, exactly what that work had been. Katniss and Peeta saw each other twice across 3 weeks, both times across a cafeteria under watch, both times for less than a minute, neither time close enough to speak freely. It sharpened, rather than weakened, the sense, true, though neither of them could have proven it yet to anyone but themselves, that two halves of the same resistance were assembling in the dark, independently, waiting for a reason to finally meet in the middle. On the second of those 2 occasions, Peeta managed, in the half-second their eyes met across the room, to press 2 fingers briefly against the side of his own bread roll before setting it down, an old private signal from the days before either of them had words for what they meant to each other. One that had once simply meant, "I'm still here, I'm still myself." Katniss did not respond visibly. She did not need to. She understood, watching him walk back out under guard, that whatever came next, neither of them intended to face it as someone the war had finished hollowing out. The arena, when the cameras finally found it on the morning the games began, looked like grief rendered into landscape. It had been built, deliberately and at considerable expense, to resemble District 12 in the days after its firebombing, the real firebombing, the one President Snow had ordered the year before in retaliation for Katniss's defiance, the one that had killed 9,000 people and left the seam a field of ash, bone, and collapsed chimneys standing alone where houses had burned to nothing around them. Coins game makers had rebuilt that devastation in careful, awful miniature, caved mine entrances, a preserved stretch of Victor's village standing intact at the center like a taunt. The meadow rendered in synthetic black ground cover that crunched underfoot the way real ash had. They had even reconstructed, with an attention to detail that struck more than one observer as obscene. The bakery's blackened storefront, complete with a half-collapsed sign that no tribute in the arena would have any reason to recognize, but that every district viewer watching at home recognized instantly, and could not stop staring at. The irony was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. Capital audiences who had cheered, or at minimum, had not objected, when their own government leveled a district full of people the year before, were now being made to watch their own children stumble, lost and frightened, through a precise replica of that exact crime, dying in it, one by one. It forced a kind of reckoning no amount of straightforward propaganda could ever have managed. This is what your president ordered. And you applauded when he did it. What went carefully, conspicuously unmentioned in every official broadcast covering the games was the other atrocity, the one closer to the new regime's own hands. The one Coin herself had ordered, the twice detonating bombs dropped on a crowd of refugee children outside Snow's mansion gates. The second wave timed with precision to kill the medics who rushed in to help the survivors of the first. Among them a 16-year-old district girl named Primrose Everdeen. No museum existed for that crime. No arena had been built to force anyone to walk through it as a lesson. It simply sat, unspoken, beneath the official story of how the war had actually ended, a silence the new government had every reason in the world to maintain. Capital audiences, watching from their own living rooms for the first time in history, did not respond the way 3/4 of a century of district viewers had been trained, by necessity, to respond. There was no public ritual for sitting through a child's death broadcast live into your home if you had never once been on the side expected to grieve quietly and go back to work the next morning. Viewership numbers, leaked years later from a propaganda office that had kept meticulous records out of pure institutional habit, showed audiences dropping by nearly a third after the second day, not from disinterest, but from something closer to a population discovering, in real time, that it could not stomach the thing it had spent decades being entertained by when it happened to someone else's. Children. Letters poured into Coin's office in volumes her staff had not prepared for, most of them careful, frightened, written in the coded language of people unsure whether complaint itself might now be treason under the new management. A smaller number praised the games as overdue justice, and those letters were the ones Coin's office chose to read aloud, selectively, on the evening broadcasts, because they were the ones that supported the story she needed Panem to believe about itself. District viewers, for their part, watched with an entirely different and far more complicated relationship to the screen. Some felt, openly, a grim satisfaction they were not ashamed of and did not bother hiding from their neighbors. Others, including more than one survivor of the old games who had expected vindication and instead found themselves simply nauseated, recognized the footage for exactly what it was, regardless of which children were dying in it, and said so, quietly, to anyone who would listen, that watching a child suffer for an audience's benefit did not become a different kind of act, depending on whose child it happened to be. The games themselves were not designed for spectacle in the way the old capital game makers had once designed for it. The children sent into that gray, ash-colored landscape had no survival training, no generational career district conditioning, no decade of half-suppressed violence to draw from when the moment demanded it. Most of them did not understand the terrain well enough to know which ruins held water and which held only the memory of it. The horror in the first days was rarely bloodshed. It was the simpler, harder thing to watch. Small, well-fed, frightened children failing to do things district tributes had learned, by brutal necessity, to do almost by instinct, dying of exposure and confusion as often as violence, sometimes within sight of food they didn't know how to recognize as food. Behind the cameras, the conscripted game maker staff, the same engineers and designers who had once built arenas to kill district children efficiently and entertainingly, found themselves arguing, for the first time in the program's history, about whether efficiency was even the goal. One senior designer, a man who had built mutts for 3 separate games under snow without apparent moral difficulty, refused outright to calibrate the arena's remaining hazards for maximum lethality, telling his supervisor flatly that he had done unconscionable things for one government already and did not intend to discover, twice in one lifetime, exactly how far that particular slope went. He was reassigned rather than punished, a small, quiet mercy that went unrecorded anywhere except in the memory of the 2 or 3 people who witnessed it. One girl, the youngest tribute at 11, spent her first night curled inside the collapsed shell of what had once been, in the real District 12, a schoolhouse, and was found the next morning frozen to death within sight of a working chimney she had not known how to light. Her death registered, in the official Game Maker log, as a single clinical line. It registered, in the homes of the Capitol families who had watched the footage live, as something closer to a national wound, one of the first cracks in the idea that any of this could be cleanly separated from what it actually was. A few tributes broke the pattern, and the cameras lingered on them accordingly. One boy, raised by a Peacekeeper Academy father on a steady diet of old Capitol triumphalism, the kind of household where Snow's portrait had hung in the front hall without irony, moved through the wreckage like a career would have, calculating, certain of his own superiority even here, a small living reminder that the worst of the old regime's values hadn't died with the man who'd embodied them. Iris Snow was not one of these. She spent her first 2 days simply trying to find the others, calling names into the ruined streets at real risk to herself, because nobody had ever taught her that doing so might be a mistake. On the second night, she found Felix, the quiet boy who had watched her more than he'd trained in the days leading up to the reaping, half buried under a collapsed section of fence in what had once been the meadow, and the 2 of them stayed together after that. Not allies in any strategic sense, but simply 2 children from the same 2 streets who had decided, independently and without discussing it, that whatever happened next would happen to both of them, or neither. Katniss watched the monitors the way she had once watched her own first games from the other side of the screen, except this time there was no Haymitch beside her muttering sponsor math under his breath, no illusion left that any of this was survivable in a way that mattered. There was only the bank of screens in the mentor's box, humming faintly, and the small, persistent figure of Iris Snow picking her way through a city built to resemble the only home Katniss had ever had. For 6 days she had performed in apathy, so convincing that even she, in unguarded moments, had begun to wonder whether it had quietly stopped being a performance and become something closer to true. She filed her mentor reports on schedule. She answered the liaison's questions and clipped useful sentences. She watched the death toll climb, a boy crushed under a collapsing chimney on the 2nd day, a girl who simply lay down in the false ash on the 4th and did not get up again. The slow erosion of children who had never once been taught how to want to live past the next meal, and she told herself, with increasing difficulty, that feeling any of it would change nothing. On the 5th night, alone in the mentor's quarters, the performance had nearly failed her in front of the one person it could not afford to fail in front of. Plutarch had come by under the pretense of reviewing footage angles for the next day's broadcast, and had instead simply sat with her in silence for the better part of an hour, watching her watch the monitors until he finally said, carefully, "You don't have to keep doing this alone." She had told him, in a voice flatter than she felt, that she didn't know what he meant. He had not pushed. He had simply left a single line on a scrap of paper before he went. Haymitch says, "You already know what you're going to do. You're just waiting for permission you don't need." And she had burned that one too, in the stairwell, and not slept at all that night. She had spent that sleepless night turning over a memory she rarely let herself revisit on purpose, the morning after her own first games ended, waking in a Capitol hospital bed to find Haymitch sitting in the corner, not saying anything. Simply present in the particular way a person is present when they've decided someone needs witnessing more than they need advice. She had not understood then why that mattered so much. She understood it now, watching herself become, for a frightened Capitol girl, the exact thing Haymitch had once quietly been for her. Then, on the 7th day, the cameras caught something that cracked the performance wide open. It happened near what had been, in the real District 12, the slag heap behind the mines, rebuilt here as a low, black hill of synthetic rubble that crunched the same way underfoot. A boy from a wealthy Capitol household, half-starved and disoriented after a week without anything resembling proper food, had collapsed at the base of it, too weak to so much as lift his arms in his own defense, while another tribute, the peacekeeper's son, the one who had taken to the arena's logic like he'd been training for it his whole life, circled closer with a length of pipe gripped in one hand, plainly intending to finish what hunger had already started. Iris stepped between them. She did not fight. She had nothing to fight with, no training, no instinct for it. She simply stood over the collapsed boy with her arms spread, and said something the directional microphones never fully caught but that every viewer in Panem understood anyway, because the gesture required no translation. Not this one, not like this. The peacekeeper's son hesitated. The same species of half-second hesitation that had cost Katniss her shot at coin weeks earlier. The kind of pause that history seemed determined to keep repeating at exactly the moments it mattered most, and in that hesitation, something in him shifted. He lowered the pipe. He walked away without a word, leaving both of them alive behind him for reasons he likely couldn't have explained to anyone, least of all himself. It was not a victory by any measure the games had ever recognized. It changed nothing about who would eventually survive, and everyone in the mentor's box understood that. But Katniss, watching from behind the glass with her jaw clenched hard enough to ache, felt the specific, physical sensation of a door swinging open in her chest that she had spent 6 careful days nailing shut, board by board. Iris herself, asked about it much later in life by a journalist who had tracked down most of the surviving tributes for an anniversary retrospective, could not fully explain her own reasoning either, beyond saying that she had simply looked at the boy on the ground and recognized, with a clarity she'd never managed about anything else in that entire arena, that letting him die that particular way would have made her into someone she didn't want to spend whatever life she had left being. It was not strategy. It was not even, she insisted, especially brave. It was only, she said, the one decision in the whole ordeal that had felt entirely her own. She thought of Rue. Not in the soft, sentimental way grief sometimes flattens a memory into something easier to hold, but specifically, completely, the exact angle of Rue's small hand as it had reached for the flowers Katniss laid around her afterward. The slow ripple of the 3-finger salute moving backward through a crowd of District 11 faces like a held breath finally let go. The unbearable, useless tenderness of decorating a child's body, because there was nothing else left in the world to give her. She remembered, too, the things she had spent years refusing to remember in any detail at all, the exact sound Rue's voice had made, calling out a warning before the spear found her. The particular weight of a dying child in her arms that no amount of time had ever fully lifted off her shoulders. The way she had sung something half-remembered and tuneless, simply because silence had seemed, in that moment, like the one thing she could not allow. She had spent years flinching away from that memory whenever it surfaced, building careful walls around it the way Peeta had once told her to build walls around the things the hijacking had warped in his own mind, treating grief itself like something that needed managing rather than feeling. Now, watching Iris stand over a stranger's collapsed body in an arena built to resemble the wreckage of Katniss's own home, She let it sit fully in the front of her mind without flinching, and instead of the paralysis she expected, something colder and far more clear arrived in its place. She understood, watching it, that she had spent 6 days telling herself a lie just as comfortable and just as false as anything Coin's propaganda office had ever produced. The lie that distance was the same thing as control, that feeling nothing was the same thing as being safe to act. Rue's death had taught her, eventually, that you could carry grief and still move. It had simply taken her years to relearn that lesson on top of everything the war had since piled onto it. Her interior voice, which had spent the days since the execution fragmenting into sharp, sensory static, cold, glass, snow, falling, found, for the first time since the arrow had been pulled from her hand, a single unbroken thread of thought. I know exactly what I'm going to do now. She did not announce it. She did not cry, or break down for the cameras Coin's office kept trained on her reactions for the nation's ongoing consumption of the Mockingjays' grief. She simply turned to her assigned liaison, in the same flat, procedural voice she'd used all week, and said she wanted to send Iris Snow a sponsor gift. It was a small thing, technically within every rule the system had ever written. A water purification tablet, the kind of unremarkable mercy a mentor was permitted to dispense without raising a single eyebrow. The liaison logged the request without comment and moved on to the next form. Katniss watched the little silver parachute fall from the sky and land in Iris's open hands on the monitor, and felt, for the first time in 6 days, something in her chest that was not performance at all. She did not sleep that night either, but for an entirely different reason than the nights before it. She lay awake turning the decision over, testing it for weakness the way she'd once tested snare wire, before trusting it with something she needed to catch, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it held. What happened over the following days would later be reconstructed, piece by careful piece, by investigators who never quite managed to prove any of it conclusively, because Katniss Everdeen understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how much erratic, unpredictable behavior the system around her had already been trained, over 2 long years, to expect and excuse. Coin's office had spent that entire time building a public narrative of the Mockingjay as fragile, traumatized, occasionally and usefully unstable, convenient when it served the cause, manageable when it didn't, but never, under any circumstance, treated as a threat that needed watching. Katniss now turned that very narrative into camouflage, with a precision that would have impressed even Plutarch Heavensby, had he been the one to think of it first. A mentor sending strange, small gifts down to her tribute, requesting odd camera angles during her interviews, spending unsupervised hours in the sponsor liaison office processing grief with the door closed. None of it triggered the alarm it should have, because everyone around her had already, collectively and for their own institutional convenience, decided that erratic was simply what she was now. Plutarch, for his part, never once asked her directly what she was doing, and she never once told him. It was a kind of professional courtesy between them. Born of 2 years spent running a rebellion through plausible deniability, he simply made sure that certain logs were reviewed a day later than they otherwise might have been, that certain footage requests were approved by an assistant rather than scrutinized personally, that the machinery of bureaucracy, when it mattered, moved exactly slowly enough. She used what she actually knew, which turned out to be considerable. Years of watching Haymitch work sponsor money into careful lifelines had taught her the unglamorous mechanics of the entire system, which routing codes moved a gift fastest, which game-maker terminals logged requests with the least oversight, which loopholes existed in the architecture simply because no one had ever imagined needing to close them against a mentor instead of a tribute. She manipulated gift codes to smuggle in more than water tablets. A length of wire, logged as costume repair material, was in fact precisely the gauge needed to bypass a tracking collar's secondary lock. A small vial, mislabeled as topical antiseptic, was in fact considerably more useful for the same purpose, applied differently. She did not act on behalf of an abstraction, and she was careful, in every choice, to keep it that way. Every decision she made in those days, she made with the specific image of Iris standing over the collapsed boy held in front of her, like a compass heading, the same way she had once volunteered for Prim without consulting a single political principle first. It was not ideology. It was the oldest instinct she had, simply redirected toward a girl she had every theoretical reason to hate and, it turned out, no actual capacity to. She did not stop at gifts. With Plutarch's quiet cooperation, never discussed directly between them, only ever implied through which camera feeds happened to malfunction at which moments. She also worked to keep the broadcast itself tilted in Iris's favor, requesting emotional coverage angles that the network's own audience research data already showed performed well, knowing the request would clear approval on commercial grounds alone without anyone upstairs examining its political effect. It was propaganda, and she understood that plainly. She had simply decided, somewhere in the last several days, that she no longer had the luxury of refusing to use the only tools the system had ever handed her. What none of the official accounts later captured was the toll the performance itself took on her, separate from the risk of discovery. Each small act of sabotage required her to first reconstruct, convincingly, the broken woman everyone already believed her to be, which meant spending hours each day deliberately inhabiting a version of her own grief calibrated for an audience rather than felt honestly for its own sake. She had hated this same demand the first time the Capitol made it of her, years earlier, dressed up in different clothes and called an interview. She hated it no less now that the demand came from the side that had supposedly liberated her, and some nights, alone, she found she could no longer fully locate the line between the performance and whatever lay underneath it, which frightened her more than the auditor ever had. The closest call came on the 9th day, when a junior auditor reviewing sponsor logs flagged the mislabeled vial for a second look, noticing that its weight didn't quite match its stated contents. Katniss was called in to explain the discrepancy in a small office that smelled of recycled air and old paper, facing a man young enough to still believe procedure could catch anything if you followed it carefully enough. She did not deny the discrepancy. She simply let her hands shake, slightly, visibly, and let her voice catch on the word Prim halfway through a sentence about why she might have made an error logging supplies meant for a dying child, and watched the auto-resolve dissolve in real time into the particular discomfort of a bureaucrat who has just remembered he is interrogating the Mockingjay about her grief. He filed the discrepancy as an administrative error and never raised it again. She walked out of that office and was sick, quietly, in the stairwell, less from fear of being caught than from how easily the performance had worked, and what that ease implied about everyone who had decided in advance exactly how broken she was allowed to be. The message to Peeta, when it finally went out, was almost insultingly low-tech. Exactly the kind of deniable, analog signal the world they had inherited still ran on, the kind no amount of capital surveillance technology had ever been built to catch because it required no technology at all. A specific phrase folded carefully into an interview about honoring those the war had cost. Meant nothing to anyone monitoring the broadcast except the one person trained, over 2 arenas worth of coded talk, to listen for exactly that phrase from exactly her voice. Same time, same place, we said goodbye. Peeta, watching the broadcast in a back room with Johanna pacing behind him and Annie sitting very still beside him, understood immediately, the way he'd understood her every coded message since the first games. He said the location out loud before the broadcast had even finished, and Johanna, who had spent weeks insisting she trusted no one's instincts but her own about timing, simply nodded and said it matched her own read of the guard rotations almost exactly, as close to an endorsement as either of them was likely to get from her. Annie said nothing at all, but reached over and gripped Peeta's hand once, hard before letting go, the closest she came most days to saying "be careful" out loud. The breach would happen at the old training center's loading bay, the place where, a lifetime and 2 games ago, frightened tributes had first been driven in, not knowing yet what was coming for them. It was not, in the end, a cinematic assault, and none of them would have wanted it to be. It was 3 people, none of them soldiers by training or temperament, exploiting a guard rotation gap that Johanna had mapped down to the minute, moving through a building most of them had already walked through once before as something other than infiltrators. The hour before it began was the worst part, by every account given afterward. They waited in a maintenance closet 2 floors below the loading bay, the air thick with the smell of cleaning solvent, none of them speaking above a whisper. Johanna spent the time running her thumb along the edge of her knife in a steady, repetitive motion that had nothing to do with sharpening it and everything to do with keeping her hands occupied. Annie sat with her eyes closed, breathing in the slow, counted pattern she had taught half the resistance by then, though everyone who watched her closely could see her lips moving slightly, counting something other than breaths. Peeta checked the schematics for the 4th time, not because he'd forgotten anything, but because his hands needed a task that wasn't simply waiting, and waiting, he had learned over the past year, was the condition under which the hijacking static found him most easily. Johanna led, because Johanna had spent a year in capital custody, learning precisely how much pain a body could absorb before it stopped being useful as information, and she applied that same cold, exact calculation now to disabling 2 guards without killing either of them. Not mercy, exactly. Just the recognition that dead guards triggered alarms faster than unconscious ones did, and speed mattered more than anything else tonight. Annie moved just behind her, reading the panic patterns of the handful of staff they encountered with an accuracy that let her predict, seconds ahead of time, who would freeze in place and who would run for an alarm, adjusting their path through the building accordingly. A skill nobody had asked her to develop, and that the war had given her anyway. Peeta held the center of the small formation, steady even when, for 3 or 4 seconds outside the GameMaker control room, his vision blurred at the edges and his hands forgot, briefly, whose fight this actually was, a flicker of old hijacking static breaking through under the stress of it. Gone again before Johanna even had time to notice, because he had learned, the hard and slow way, exactly how to keep moving through it without stopping to explain. The control room itself was almost disappointingly mundane once they reached it, banks of monitors throwing pale light across the walls. A single technician who surrendered without a fight the moment Johanna's knife found the pulse point at his throat. And a console that BT patched in remotely from a terminal he would later, under careful questioning, insist had been used for unrelated maintenance work, talked Peeta through in under 4 minutes. The single complication came from a second technician, unaccounted for in Johanna's schematics because he had only been reassigned to the night shift 2 days earlier, who emerged from a side room mid-breach and froze. For just a moment. At the sight of 3 armed civilians where none should have been. Annie reached him before he could decide what to do about it, not with violence, but with something closer to recognition. She had seen that exact freeze 100 times in tribute footage, and on her own face in mirrors she'd avoided for years. And she simply said his name, which she'd memorized off a roster Johanna had copied weeks earlier, in a calm, ordinary voice, the way you'd address someone sleepwalking. He did not raise an alarm. He sat down on the floor where he stood and put his hands over his face, and stayed there, unmoving, until it was over. The force field dropped with a sound like a held breath finally released. The mutts, engineered specifically for this games and never yet deployed, simply lost power mid-stride and went still in their holding pens, an almost bureaucratic non-event compared to the violence the moment had seemed, all week, to be building toward. Afterward, none of them spoke for a long minute. Johanna was the one who finally broke it, dropping into the technician's vacated chair with a laugh that had no real humor in it, saying only that she'd planned for fire and gotten paperwork, and didn't know yet whether that counted as a win. Peeta sat down hard on the floor beside the still-shaking second technician, not to guard him but, oddly, to keep him company. The same instinct that had once made him share bread with a starving girl in the rain, regardless of what it cost him. Annie stood by the now dead monitors and watched the last of the mutts go still in their pens, and said quietly, to no one in particular, that it was the first time in either war she'd been part of something ending without anyone she loved having to die for it. They left the building the way they'd come, through the loading bay, slipping back into the ordinary night before anyone outside the control room had registered that anything had happened at all. None of them celebrated. There was, all three of them seemed to understand without discussing it, something obscene about celebrating the mere absence of one more atrocity, as though stopping a thing that should never have started in the first place were itself an achievement worth marking with anything more than quiet, exhausted relief. The technician who had simply sat down and put his hands over his face was found the next morning by his own supervisor, still in roughly the same spot, and gave, when finally able to speak, an account so vague and contradictory that no formal charge was ever brought against him. He kept his job. He never spoke of that night again to anyone who later asked, though Annie, who crossed paths with him once more years afterward at a transit station, thought she recognized in his face the particular, permanent quiet of someone who had been given, against all odds, a chance to do nothing harmful at the one moment in his life it had mattered most, and had taken it. For the first time in the recorded history of either set of games, someone had broken into the system not to slip one tribute out unnoticed, but to stop the entire machine, mid-operation, on behalf of all of them at once. It was, Peeta would say later, quietly and only once, the only thing in the whole war that had felt like it actually undid something, rather than simply surviving it. Coin received word of the breach with the same flat composure she had used to announce the games in the first place, the composure of a woman who processed catastrophe as a logistics problem first, and a moral one only later, if at all. She gave orders for the survivors to be recovered, the breach contained, the public narrative carefully managed before it could spread. She did not yet understand, giving those orders, that the most dangerous person in her entire government had already walked, unscorted and unannounced, into her office. Katniss had not run. She had walked the length of 3 corridors and 2 stairwells at an even, unhurried pace, the bow held loosely at her side the way a mentor might carry equipment back to storage. And at no point had anyone stopped her, though at least one person could have. A young guard posted outside the administrative wing, one of the same new recruits drawn from outside the old Star Squad, too young to have built up much loyalty to anyone yet, recognized her immediately, glanced once at the bow, and then simply looked away, out toward the empty corridor beyond, as though something out there had suddenly required his full attention. He would later tell investigators when finally asked that he hadn't been able to explain to himself in the moment why he hadn't called it in, only that something in him had decided, without consulting the rest of him first, that he did not want to be the reason this particular door stayed shut. There were no guards in the office itself. Coin had not thought to request any. Katniss had spent weeks performing exactly the kind of broken, manageable compliance that made a direct confrontation seem, to anyone watching her closely, like something that simply wasn't in her anymore. That performance turned out to be the last and most effective weapon she had left. "You let it happen," Katniss said. "It was not a question." Coin looked up from whatever report had been occupying her before the door opened, and for a moment something flickered across her face that might, in a less disciplined person, have been alarm. It passed quickly. She set the report down with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and folded her hands, and waited, the posture of a woman who had survived a great many difficult conversations by simply outlasting the other person's nerve. Coin did not deny it, and made no attempt to perform remorse she clearly didn't feel. "I let the system function exactly the way the victors voted for it to function," she said. in the same tone she might have used to cite a routine policy memo. "You voted yes yourself, if you recall." She did not raise her voice even slightly. She still believed, completely and without apparent strain, that what she had done was defensible, and that, more than anything else she could have said, was the detail that made her, in the end, more frightening than Snow had ever managed to be. Snow, at least, had always known precisely what he was. "I voted yes because I thought I'd be the one to end it myself," Katniss said, "not because I thought any of it should happen at all. And yet, you said yes." Coin's voice did not rise. It was, if anything, gentler than before, the gentleness of someone explaining an obvious thing to a person she still believed she might be able to manage. "You understand power better than you let people see, Katniss. You always have. That's precisely why I was willing to risk this much rope with you." She paused, and for the briefest moment something almost like genuine puzzlement crossed her face, as if she truly could not locate the line between what she had done and what Snow had done before her. "Tell me what you think the alternative was. A peace built on letting the people who burned your district go entirely unanswered? I removed the man who ordered your sister's death. I would have removed the system that allowed it, eventually, once the country could bear it." "You didn't remove the system," Katniss said. "You just renamed it and put yourself in charge of it." Coin's expression did not change, but something in the room did. The particular stillness of a person recalculating, mid-conversation, exactly how much danger they were actually in. She reached, slowly, for something on the edge of the desk, an old habit from a lifetime of meetings where the right document at the right moment had always been enough to regain control of a room. It was not enough this time. Coin opened her mouth to say something further, a justification, perhaps, or an order directed at guards she still seemed to assume were somewhere nearby, and never finished the sentence. By the time Plutarch and Haymitch reached the office, summoned by a junior aide too rattled to explain clearly what she'd just witnessed, Katniss was sitting very still in the chair across from Coin's desk. The bow set down carefully on the floor beside her, as though it might still go off on its own if handled carelessly. She did not resist when they led her out. She did not say much of anything for several days afterward, and no one who had watched the last 2 years of her life pushed her to. News of Coin's death moved through the building before any official statement could shape it, and the reactions, recorded later by more than one historian piecing the day together from scattered accounts, were not what either side might have predicted. There was no uprising in her defense, no grief that rose to the level of the mourning that had followed Snow's fall the year before. Mostly there was a kind of exhausted, wary quiet, the particular silence of a population that had learned, twice now in 2 years, not to celebrate too loudly before finding out who was in charge next. The young guard who had looked away in the corridor was questioned briefly, days later, by an investigator who seemed almost relieved to be told he'd seen nothing worth reporting. He gave his statement, was thanked for his cooperation, and returned to his post that same afternoon, where he would serve, eventually, under Paler's reorganized civilian police structure for another 2 decades, without ever once mentioning, to colleagues or family, the specific door he had once chosen not to defend. The arrow Katniss used was a different one than the arrow that had fallen, unfired, into the snow weeks earlier. But everyone who later told the story insisted on connecting the two, on imagining some invisible, patient thread running from that first failed shot all the way to this one, as though the weeks between had simply been the time the world needed to let the same arrow land twice. It was not, strictly speaking, true. It felt true enough that almost no one ever bothered correcting it. Plutarch, when he finally spoke to the small group of officials gathered in the corridor outside, chose his words with the same careful precision he had once used to keep an entire rebellion hidden inside a game-maker's office, and said only that the president had died in the course of events still being investigated. A sentence technically true in every particular, and designed, deliberately, to buy the country a few days of uncertainty before it had to decide how to feel about what had actually happened. The surviving tributes went home within the week. 11 children in all, Iris Snow among them, returned to families who would spend years, some of them, slowly unlearning what the arena had tried to teach their bodies about fear. The Hunger Games were formally and permanently abolished under the interim government that coalesced, with surprising speed, around Commander Paler, who had spent the war running District 8's field hospitals rather than its propaganda machine, and seemed, to nearly everyone who worked with her, constitutionally incapable of Coin's particular flavor of bureaucratic cruelty. Elections were promised. Unlike Coin's promises, these were eventually and somewhat astonishingly kept. Paler's first acts in office were administrative, rather than symbolic, which was, in its own quiet way, the most radical choice available to her. She disbanded the rebranded Guard entirely, rather than simply renaming it again, folding its personnel into a civilian police structure answerable to elected district councils instead of a central command. She ordered the full, unredacted record of both the victor's vote and the mansion bombing entered into the historical archive, over the objections of advisors who warned her it would cost the new government public trust it could not afford to lose. It cost her some. It cost her less than the alternative would eventually have, once the truth surfaced anyway. As it always did. Castor Ware was quietly reinstated to his old post, his role in the breach never formally acknowledged, and, at his own continued insistence, never publicly named. Katniss stood trial, briefly and almost perfunctorily, for the killing of a sitting president, her friends arguing, successfully and not entirely dishonestly, that 2 games and a war had left her too damaged to be held to an ordinary standard of culpability. Haymitch testified. So did Plutarch, carefully in language designed to make the victor's vote sound like exactly the trap it had been, rather than the willing complicity Coin had wanted the record to show. Peeta testified last, and said almost nothing about culpability at all. Only that he had watched the same woman who shot an arrow at a starving boy's tormentor turn that arrow, eventually, on the person responsible for making that choice necessary in the first place, and that he did not see how a country claiming to value mercy could call that a crime. Katniss was not imprisoned. She went home instead, which felt, to her, like a stranger sentence than prison would have. Gale was offered, and accepted, a senior post in District 2's new civil administration, a decision that surprised no one who had watched the war reshape him into someone more comfortable with strategy than with the people that strategy was meant to protect. Katniss did not go to see him off. The wall between them, built out of a single unanswered question about whose design had killed Prim, never came down. If anything, the question answered itself in everyone's mind once Coin's authorship of the mansion bombing became impossible to keep hidden, though by then neither of them had the appetite left to revisit it directly. They exchanged perhaps 4 letters over the following decade, each shorter than the last. Iris Snow went home to a mansion that had been seized, subdivided, and reassigned to house 3 displaced capital families, and grew up, against most reasonable expectations, into someone who spent her adult life teaching displaced children, first capital orphans of the war. Later, when the program expanded, district children as well, without ever quite being able to explain to any of them why she'd chosen the work. She kept a single photograph from before the war, of herself at 11 in a braid she no longer wore, and never threw it away, and never explained that either. District 12 was still mostly ash by the time Katniss got there. The same wound the arena had spent days forcing an entire nation to stare at from a stranger's perspective, except this version was real, and hers, and not built by anyone's game makers. She and Haymitch were among the first to return. Peeta arrived not long after, steadier than he had been in over a year, though some mornings still came harder than others, and likely always would. Rebuilding, when it began, was slow and unglamorous in exactly the way the war's ending had been. There was no grand ceremony for the laying of the first new foundation. There was simply Haymitch. Sober more often than not those days, arguing with a District 13 engineer about whether the new houses should be built from local timber or shipped concrete, and winning, mostly because he refused to stop arguing until he did. Greasy Say reopened something resembling her old stall in the rebuilt square within the first month, and the smell of her stew drifting across streets that had been ash a season earlier became, for more than one returning resident, the first thing that had felt unmistakably like home again. Some of the old Seam families never came back at all, having scattered during the worst of the fighting to districts that offered work or simply distance. And no one begrudged them that choice, least of all Katniss, who understood better than most how much a place could hold of what you'd rather not remember. The ones who did return rebuilt slowly, house by house, in an order that owed more to who still had the strength for it than to any official plan, and within 2 years the Seam looked, from a distance, almost like a town again, if you didn't look too closely at which chimneys were new and which had simply been left standing because no one could bear to tear them down. The ending, when it finally came, was not a triumph, and no one who lived through it would have wanted it dressed up as one. There was no parade, no monument unveiled in the city circle, no closing speech delivered to a grateful and watching nation. It was smaller than that, and truer for being small, a kitchen in a half-rebuilt house. A pot of soup neither of them needed help making anymore. A quiet that no longer had to be filled with anything in particular to feel survivable. Some evenings Peeta painted, slow, careful studies of things that had not hurt anyone, bread cooling on a rack, the specific gold of late light through the kitchen window, and Katniss watched him do it without needing to say what it meant that he could. Some evenings she still woke reaching for a bow that wasn't there, and he learned the way he learned most things about her, by paying close and patient attention rather than asking outright, exactly when to simply put his hand over hers until the reaching stopped. Mercy, in the end, had not been a single dramatic act, not the arrow that missed, not the gifts smuggled into an arena disguised as routine kindness, not even the one that finally landed where it was meant to. It had been the slow, unglamorous accumulation of people choosing, again and again, in small, unwitnessed moments, not to become the thing that had hurt them, until eventually enough of those choices had stacked together that something almost resembling peace became possible to build a life on. Years later, a teacher named Iris brought a class of district children to visit the rebuilt museum that now stood where the old training center had been, and paused, as she always did on these visits, at a small, unremarkable display case near the end of the exhibit holding a single arrow, retrieved and preserved long after the fact, that had never struck anything at all. She did not tell the children the whole story behind it, partly because she did not know all of it herself, and partly because some of what she did know belonged to people who had never asked her to repeat it. She told them only that it was kept there to remind people that the most important moment in a long war was sometimes the one where nothing happened, where a shot missed, where a hand reached out instead of closing into a fist, and that this, more than any of the speeches carved into the walls around it, was the part of the story actually worth remembering. It was not, in the end, a story that finished. It was simply one that, for the first time in 3 generations, stopped repeating itself. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.